Final Fantasy, one of the most popular franchises in the gaming sphere, debuted way back in 1987 on the Famicom. Final Fantasy was a turn-based RPG where a party of heroes must join forces to eliminate the big bad Garland. I mean Chaos. While most Final Fantasy games would use some variation of this formula, Square, now known as Square Enix, the creators of Final Fantasy, would experiment with different ways to play their games. Final Fantasy Tactics, for instance, would take the static gameplay of the past and revamp it with the player moving and controlling multiple characters on an isometric battlefield. Final Fantasy Type 0 went the action route and has more in common with current Final Fantasies than the mainline release at the time, Final Fantasy XIII. 2, which, while having more action elements than usual, is still closer to a traditional Final Fantasy game compared to the recent releases. And of course, who could forget Final Fantasy Arena Fighter Edition Dissidia. While the first two Dissidia games would be PSP exclusive, the third one, Dissidia Final Fantasy NT, would make its way to arcades, the PlayStation 4, and Windows. The most interesting thing here, though, is instead of Square Enix developing it like the first two entries, they would enlist the help of Team Ninja. Team Ninja, most known for making the fighting game franchise Dead or Alive, the hack and slash series Ninja Gaiden, and the two games most relevant to this story, Neo 1 and 2. While there's some arguing about this, most people will agree that the Neo games are Team Ninja's attempt at a Souls-like, or at the very least are heavily inspired by the Souls games. The first Neo would be released in 2017, 2 years after Dissidia Final Fantasy NT. Neo 2 would then come 3 years later in 2020. But why is any of this important? Well, Square Enix would enlist Team Ninja's help once again with the release of the closest thing we have to a Final Fantasy Soulslike, Stranger of Paradise.
Looks like chaos has been waiting for us.
Think Nick is going there and find you?
People on the internet will debate what truly makes a Souls-like ad nauseum. Does it have a bonfire mechanic? Do you lose some kind of resource on death? What about shortcuts that loop back to the start? Or difficult combat and random lore tidbits hidden around the world? While some of those are more generic and could apply to a lot of games, when combined they help paint the picture that at the very least, the game is influenced by the FromSoft tree. Stranger of Paradise combines those previously listed mechanics and is something I would consider a Souls-like gateway. While not as hardcore as the Souls games, it's a nice way to segue into them while still playing a Souls-like. With the groundwork now laid, did Square Enix and Team Ninja successfully make an enjoyable Final Fantasy Souls-like, or was the jank too much to overcome? Stranger of Paradise is a Final Fantasy game. That's important to remember because, like a lot of Final Fantasy games, the plot here is a little convoluted. Jack and the gang of misfits who would later recruit to aid him on his mission wake up with no memories, except that they must slay Chaos. After getting the King's blessing, they go fight the entity they believe to be Chaos, only to find out this is in fact not Chaos, but another misfit who believes Chaos is a myth. She planned to gather all the darkness in the world, become Chaos, and die to a band of heroes, vanquishing the darkness for good. This is an important plot point, and is kind of foreshadowing the end. This is also where some of our problems begin. Jack is not very likable. Even after playing through the whole game, I'm unsure if the famous earbud scene was for comedic effect, or if the devs thought Jack was being a badass. From cutscenes to party dialogue, Jack toes the line from being edgy badass to an outright parody, and it conflicts with what is supposed to be a serious story. As the plot advances, it adds more twists and turns, like time travel and secret overlords engineering everything, and then made it even more complicated than it already is because you have to link that story to another story from 35 years ago. It's neat when you read the wiki page for it, but when you play the game, it's like,
Okay.
well, I'm not going to spoil every single detail about the plot. I do want to go over some things. Your party never stops talking. Even the members you aren't using will still talk, and while some of it is just chatter about the current level, there's a lot of subtle plot exposition getting dropped by the lads. So if you want to understand the story, at least from your party's perspective better, you have to pay attention to what they are saying. One thing I don't understand though is this guy. Early in the game, we have to meet this innkeeper twice before going to rest. Why are these cutscenes here? They don't add anything to the story. They don't even look good. It's weird and janky. If the purpose is to show our band of heroes going to sleep for the day, why not just show them walking to the inn and fade to black? Why waste our time looking at this scene twice for no reason? Look at his mouth, what is he doing? But seriously, the plot is supposed to be a mystery, even though most people probably guessed correctly what was going to happen to Jack. even with no prior knowledge of Final Fantasy 1. The game is light on specific plot details until the end of the game, where they start cramming in as much plot as possible, only to hide the real ending behind DLC. I don't mind DLC that continues the story after its conclusion, if there is a satisfying end to the main game already, but when the game ends on a cliffhanger, only for that cliffhanger to be answered in paid DLC, it kinda leaves a bad taste in my mouth. By the time I finished the game on hard, I was pretty much done. Combined with the fact that DLCs have a mixed review, I just watched the story cutscenes on YouTube. The shining gem in Stranger of Paradise is the combat. There's a long list of classes, each class has their own ability, skill trees, and can equip various weapons. Every weapon type has multiple combos, which can be animation cancelled into weapon swap combos, or abilities gained from parrying. Yes, Strangers of Paradise has a parry system. The execution of parry is not difficult, and just requires the player to hold a button relatively right before you get hit. Certain abilities that have this purple box will give you a charge of that ability when parried, allowing the player to send it back to the enemy. There's also the standard break gauge that stun locks the character when emptied, which allows Jack to execute them, something that's reminiscent of like a God of War finisher. But unfortunately, the systems around combat will let the game down. Stranger of Paradise uses a party system, where the player is always accompanied by 2 other party members. While these party members each have their own classes, for the most part you can just pick who you like, and the fights will still play the same. They also help make the game easier by being able to pull aggro off of you, so you can heal or channel magic abilities. Overall, the party system was a neat idea, and fun to play around with, although the different members don't necessarily change your playstyle. Like a lot of Soulslikes, magic is a bit unbalanced here. In the early to mid game, magic spells cleared the normal enemy encounters just as well, if not better, than normal weapons, while also greatly decreasing the risk of death thanks to being so far away. Even later in the game, when I was using Void Knight as my main melee class, I would swap to my Red Mage secondary just to spam haste on myself, making the boss fights a lot easier. Speaking of boss fights, they were the only things I was interested in once I got past the first handful of levels. The boss fights in this game are varied and interesting, and are the highlight in terms of enemies. The regular enemy encounters became a boring slog. I reached a point in the game, probably the last 8 levels, where the regular mobs just felt like time patterns before the boss. They stopped posing a challenge and were just things I would run past unless I had to fight them. It also doesn't help that the game loop for most levels is the same. The player has to open this level's variation of a door. It could be an elevator, an object that changes what time the location is, it could even be a door. Either way, once you notice that seemingly every level is opening that level's variety of door 2 to 3 times before fighting a boss, the levels become a lot more boring and stale. The game boasts side missions, which are generally played on the same levels you already cleared, and are about defeating random enemy mobs or defeating a boss from the main quest. They aren't very exciting, and I stopped doing most of them because you don't need the items. Speaking of items, let's talk items. The game loves throwing loot at you, but the loot is not interesting in the slightest. None of the stats are exciting enough or change your playstyle enough to worry about min-maxing. I finished the game just hitting auto-itemization after I picked up better gear. There is this disenchant and upgrade system for gear that might make you think, oh, that's useful. I can keep upgrading the gear I like to be viable, but when I say there's no point to it, I mean it. Look at this item level jump. The mission level is 62, but my average item level was 51. Should I go grind resources to upgrade my gear? No. What I should do is load into the level, kill a couple of baddies, and boom, have a whole new loadout 11 levels higher than the gear I came in with. It's a waste of time. After this mission, the item levels kept jumping, so I would just keep getting new loadouts multiple levels better than what I came in with right at the start. It's honestly baffling that the game was designed this way. Now after beating the game, you unlock Chaos difficulty, and after you buy the DLC, you unlock even harder modes. It's possible that the developers fixed this wonky gearing system, but that is no excuse since the majority of players stop after beating the game once. Only 25% of players use the mastery point, something you unlock after beating the game. Only 21% of players interacted with the crafting system enough to fully upgrade the special effect of a piece of equipment. There was massive oversight around the gearing up systems, at least for the average playthrough, and it's hard to overlook in a game that showers you with loot. Strangers of Paradise is another game in the never-ending list of games that does one thing well and is let down by seemingly everything else to various degrees. I believe if this was a standalone game with no ties to the Final Fantasy IP, this would just be another mediocre Souls-like with an interesting twist on combat, and I probably would not be making this video right now. But with the brand recognition comes more attention and more expectations, and unfortunately, I don't believe Stranger Paradise hit the peaks it could have. If there's one thing I'm going to remember about this game 5 years, 10 years later, it's how more games should incorporate the job system and the animation canceling combos, which I guess is better than the amount of games either forgotten or remembered because of how awful they were. If you have played Stranger Paradise before, post your thoughts below. Stranger Paradise is by no means a bad game, it's just heavily carried by the combat system, and when even the regular encounters start to become boring, we have a problem. I didn't mention it earlier, but I wouldn't pay the normal $50 for the game. I would recommend it on sale though. Also, play the game first before you buy the DLC, because from what I saw, it's just more of the same. So if you're digging the base game, go ahead. Otherwise, you can skip the DLC. If you liked the video, hit that thumbs up button, and subscribe if you aren't, it helps the channel grow. My name's Yuo, and I'll see you in the next one.